this was the graph that was given to you, right? Like this, and then and this, right? Then you were given the demand supply diagram, right? So your supply was going like this, right? Sorry, supply was going like this. This is your demand and this is your supply. So this is your supply and this is your, it's too much of a pen, right? But yeah, something of the sort, right? So students, this was your demand curve and this is your supply curve. Okay. Now the statement was saying that an unstable disequilibrium is when you do not come to the original equilibrium position. An unstable disequilibrium is when you do not come to the original equilibrium position, right? After being moved from there. Okay. Now, what you need to see that you were given A was over here. This was A, price A. This was B, right? This was B. This was where C was. And then this was B, this was C. And then this was, sorry, A was on top. Sorry, my bad. I just realized A was on top, right? Right. Disequilibrium, yeah. So disequilibrium is when your supply and demand are not equal. When your supply and demand are not equal, that's a disequilibrium. We know that, right? Okay, students, just a second, right? So this was your demand curve. Okay, now the options were A, B, C, and D. Now think about this. If this is the original equilibrium, and let's say you move from this point. Now, if you go to point D, students, now pay attention carefully. This should be easy. So if you are on D, which is greater and which is lower? If you can see that D is cutting the demand curve at this point. So this would be your demand, product demand, and this much would be your product supply. So when demand is greater than supply, what happens? When demand is greater than supply, students, would the price rise or would the price decrease? If demand is greater than supply, the price will rise. So you will move from point D, to the equilibrium point. Does it make sense? So it's not unstable. Eventually you are moving to the equilibrium. So if you are operating on price D, Abdurrahim, is this clear? Demand, as you saw it for yourself, that it is cutting the demand curve. This curve thing is the demand curve. So this is how much the demand would be at this point. This is how much the supply would be at this point. When demand is greater than supply, prices rise, and automatically you'll reach the equilibrium, initial equilibrium point. Is this simple? Similarly, in the case of C, demand is greater than supply. Students, sorry, supply is greater than demand. Supply is greater because this straight line is the supply curve. Supply is greater than demand. So when supply is greater than demand, what happens, students? When supply is greater than demand, your prices decrease. And obviously you will come back to this equilibrium point. You will come to this equilibrium point. Similarly, in the case of BC, right? In the case of B, again, supply is greater than demand. So when supply is greater and demand is less, prices will decrease and you'll come back to the original point, equilibrium point. But what is happening at A? Demand is already greater. This is where it's cutting the demand curve. So demand is already greater than the supply, and therefore the prices would only rise even further. The prices will only rise further. And this is your supply, right? This is your supply, right? So when demand is greater than supply, obviously the prices will only rise, and therefore you will not be able to reach the original equilibrium position at this point. You will not be able to reach original equilibrium position at this point. Is it making sense? Right? Got it? Arbab, Abdul Rahim, Elsa? So that's what you need to understand. Okay, what other question you had problem with? Great. Okay, Arbab, so think about this. Unstable was the idea. Are you asking me about A? So at point A, think about this. At point A, what is happening? In all the other points, you were reaching the equilibrium position. Why? Because either the prices were increasing or the prices were reducing. At point A, what is true? Think about this. It cuts the demand curve at this point. The straight horizontal line is showing you the price level. So it's cutting your demand curve at this point and it's cutting your supply curve at this point. So when demand is greater than supply, what happens to prices? Prices will rise. And when prices rise above this, will you ever reach back to this equilibrium point? Will you ever reach to this? Right. You will not. Whereas in all the other cases, you were coming back to the original equilibrium. How? Because at point B, at price B, you can see supply is greater than demand. So when supply is greater than demand, prices fall. Prices fall, you will eventually come to meet this equilibrium. Similarly, at price level C, you can see for yourself that supply is greater than demand. So again, the prices will fall, you'll reach to this equilibrium. But in the case of D, demand was greater than supply, so prices will rise and you will come back to this equilibrium. But only it's A where it's not happening, right? So it's a shortage and prices will rise even further and you will not come back to the original equilibrium that you wanted to, right? No, when but prices, think about this. It will be reached eventually, but Abdurrahim, not at this point, not at the point of original equilibrium. Are you getting me? Because they are never meeting, right? Another thing that you would have noticed that supply is never, so this is the trajectory of supply and this is the trajectory of the demand. So demand is always increasing faster than the supply. That's the problem. Are you getting me? So the two lines are not converging. The two lines are diverging, right? So these two lines are, so think about it. If these are the two lines, right? Even though they haven't met, these two lines haven't met, but you can tell that if we continue these two lines, they will somewhere intersect. They will converge. These are converging lines. Diverging lines, on the other hand, are going in the opposite direction, right? So if this line is going over here, this line is going over here, right? Going over here. So if I continue extending these lines on this part, so they will go further apart from each other. They will not intersect, right? Got it? Okay, what other questions? Yeah, Elsa? Okay, 14, right. To improve the financial position, a country decided to reduce expenditure on investment in the public sector. Despite this, there was not a fall in economic growth. What was most likely effect of the government's action? An original budget deficit was reduced. An original budget surplus was reduced. Right. Consumer expenditure decreased. Public sector productivity decreased. Okay, to improve its financial position, a government decided to reduce expenditure on investment in public sector. Despite this, there was not a fall in economic growth. What was the most likely effect of the government's action? An original budget deficit was reduced. Original budget surplus was reduced, right? Budget deficit was reduced. Consumer expenditure decreased. I think it should be A, right? Yeah, it should be A, right? Is the answer A? Elsa? Okay, so, okay, think about this. So the question was tricky, I will admit that, and the two things are not making much sense. On one hand, it says that the government reduced its expenditure. I agree, that's fine. And there was not a fall in economic growth. Now think about this. If you look at C and if you look at D, Elsa, consumer expenditure decrease. So when consumer expenditure will decrease and government spending is also decreasing, then obviously overall your aggregate expenditure will fall. Are you getting me? Think about this. So what is aggregate expenditure made up of? It is made up of C plus I plus G plus X minus M, right? X minus M. Now, if G is reducing, it says that the government reduced its spending, right? Government expenditure reduced, and C is also reducing. Then overall, your aggregate demand will reduce, and therefore there will be less national income. There will be lower national income. consumer expenditure decrease, right? Is it making sense? So that means that the economic growth will decrease. Elsa? So C could not be the answer, because if consumer expenditure is also decreasing, aggregate demand will decrease and your economic growth would fall. Same goes for this option, public sector productivity. What is productivity? Productivity is the efficiency with which you are producing the output. Productivity is the efficiency with which you are producing your output. So if your productivity is decreasing, right, most probably your output would fall and therefore economic growth would decrease. Now think about this. You were left with these two options, basically A and B, right? Right. Abdul, so it's just saying that the government decided to reduce expenditure on the public sector. Now, what is the spending on public sector? It is G, right? The government spending is G. So it is reducing that spending, right? And it does not want that to lead to fall in economic growth, right? Even though the government spending is reducing, the government doesn't want the economic growth to decrease. Now think about this. One thing that I want to really tell you, that sometimes MCQs, now if you ask me, this was a stupid MCQ, right? Because economic growth, it never talks about the economic growth in the options, right? But the thing is that you have to read the options very carefully and then see which of these is kind of linking to what the statement says. Now think about this. If expenditure, did you get this part of the name? Expenditure on investment in the public sector. So you did understand that G is reducing. When G is reducing, what is budget deficit? Budget deficit is when your spending is less, right? So what is budget deficit? Just a second. So your budget deficit is basically when spending is more and revenue through taxes is less. So government spending is more, right? And taxes is less, right? And opposite to that is, when spending is more and taxes are less. And opposite is a situation where it's the surplus. Opposite is a situation where there's a surplus, right? And that is when taxes are more and spending is less. So just a second. Taxes are more and government spending is less. Just a second. Government spending is less, right? So you were just right. You were just supposed to choose the option that explains what is most likely to happen. So when government is spending less, right, and with the same amount of taxes, so we do know that the deficit would be reduced. We do know that the deficit would be reduced, right? Otherwise, if you start thinking about that these options are not making sense, I agree with you, but you know, we can't help that, right? Easy, clear? Students, any confusion, anything that's not clear? Elsa, did you get this? Right? So it's important to try to understand the question, but sometimes the options might not be directly related. So read the options first and then try to see which of those is making at least more sense. What is the question? Okay, 15th and 20. Okay. An economy has 20% housing shortage. The government builds 10% more homes for poorer families and fixes the rent below the equilibrium for the market. What effect will this direct provision have on the market? A greater imbalance in the market and private housing will develop. Housing waiting list for poor families will be cleared. The supply of government housing will fall short of demand. Right. The supply of private housing for rent will fall by 10%. Fall by 10%. Interesting. Which effect will this direct provision have on the market? A greater imbalance in the market. Housing waiting list for poor families will be cleared. The supply of government housing will fall short of demand, and the supply of private housing for rent will fall by 10%. Below the equilibrium for the market. Below the equilibrium for the market. The supply of private housing for rent will fall by 10% and fixes the rent. I think it should be C. Is it C? Right. Right. Okay. Okay. Now think about this. Students, think about this. So there is a 20% shortage in the market. There's 20% shortage in the market. Now what that means, demand is greater than supply. We know that, right? Instead of providing 20% houses, the government only provided 10%. I repeat, instead of producing 20% more homes, which was the shortage, the government only fulfilled 10% of that, right? Okay. Now it says which effect this direct provision have on the market. A greater imbalance? No, not a greater imbalance. Why? Because at least some imbalance has been met. Think about this. So let me show you on a graph. Students, think about this. So a greater imbalance is not possible because government is trying to make up some of the deficit, some of the shortfall. How do we show a shortfall on the graph? Think about this. So when demand is more and supply is less, right? So when demand is more for any product and supply is less, that's a shortage, right? So demand at this level is, let's say, D1, supply at this level is S1. So there is shortage in the market. Easy. Confusion, students, anything that you do not understand. Okay. Now, government did not meet the entire shortage. Government only provided 10% of that, right? So let's say 10% additional homes were provided by the government, right? So there is still a shortage, right? But so the shortage has reduced, but it is still there, right? Not all of that has been met, right? Now, this being said, so it will not be greater imbalance because government did produce some of the additional homes. Government did produce some of the additional homes. Students, are you following me or not? Right? So I just eliminated this option by reading the answer that it's greater imbalance, right? So that's what I did. Okay. Now for the B part, it said housing waiting list for poor families will be cleared. When you impose a maximum price, so below the equilibrium price means it's a maximum price. When anything is imposed, when maximum price is imposed, right? Will the waiting list be cleared? Will the waiting list be cleared? You tell me, right? So when there's a maximum price, it's kind of a maximum price here. Think about this. So when the government imposes a maximum price, will the waiting list be cleared? Cleared meaning that there is no shortage. It leads to shortage, exactly. Arbab, think about this. The statement was saying it was more of, tricky because of the language it uses. Housing waiting list for poorer families will be cleared. So if for the poor families, government has set the rent below the equilibrium. So would people, think about this, would landlords want to accommodate poor families? No, because they know that they will not be able to pay the rent at the equilibrium. They will not be able to pay the rent not cleared, right? About does it make sense? So that would not be cleared because I would not want to rent my house to poor families knowing that they are paying me rent less than the equilibrium. So otherwise, if the market value for rent is 50,000 rupees per month now, but for the poor families, the government has set it below the equilibrium, which means it's 30,000 or 20,000, then I would not want to have poor families in my home because they are paying me rent less than the other people, right? Now, I'll come to the C part at the end. D said the supply of private housing for rent will fall by 10%. The supply of private housing for rent will fall by 10%. Now, think about this. Why would there be an effect on the supply of private housing? Are you getting me? So private economy, private sector has already produced the amount of homes that it wanted to based on the profit margins, right? Now, this is counterintuitive, right? If government is providing 10% more homes and there's still a shortage, the statement says that the supply of private homes, housing for rent, will fall by 10%, right? The supply doesn't fall, right? Are you getting me? For rent will fall by 10%. So it will not fall, it will stay where it is, right? So think about this. If this is the market for rent, if the government has set a maximum price, so we do know that there will be a shortage, there will be a difference between demand and supply, but it is not as if the supply would fall even further, right? It will not be like that, right? So to be very honest over here, no option was making direct sense. So I went with the elimination method, right? And C is kind of making a little sense because the supply of government housing will fall short of demand. Yes. How can we say that? Because initially there was 20% shortage, so the government should have provided for the 20% of the homes, but the government only provided 10% of those homes. So that is what it meant. The supply of government housing, what the government is supplying, is still short of the demand that exists, right? Okay, so just a second, Arbab, I'll answer your question. So the supply of private housing for rent will fall by 10%, right? Nothing but this. So Abdurrahim, D is not making much sense. The supply of private housing for rent. Whatever the private homes have supplied, they have supplied. And then, okay, even if that falls, how do they know that it will be exactly fall by 10%? Are you getting me? So we do know that the government set a maximum price below the equilibrium, but they did not mention how much below the equilibrium, right? Are you following me? So it says, and the government fixes the rent below the equilibrium for the market. Then how come the statement be so sure that the supply of private housing will only fall by 10%? Are you getting me? And when you read C, right, when you see C, that makes more sense compared to D. The supply of government housing will fall short of demand. The supply of government housing will fall short of demand. How can we say that? Yes, because there was initially 20% shortage in the housing market and government only provided for 10% of that. So obviously the remaining 10% will be considered as a shortage. Gotcha. Okay. Now, what was your question, Arbab? What is money wage rate? Nominal. Money wage rate, basically nominal. What you are actually receiving in your bank account. What you're actually receiving in your bank account. When you subtract inflation from the nominal, you get the real wage rate. Money, wherever it says money, right? It's nominal. Arbab, is this clear? Question 20. Okay. What would cause a shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve, but not the long-run aggregate supply curve? Short-run aggregate supply curve is affected by cost. Long-run aggregate supply cost is not affected by cost. Advances in technology, both will be affected. Immigration of people of working age, both will be affected. Gross investment exceeding depreciation, gross investment, right? So yeah, the answer should be B, right? Got it? Okay, so think about this. Ilsa and Abdurrahim, did you guys get the chance to read through it? So take a minute, read through it, and then explain. Okay, read it. Right. Ilsa, think about this. So I explained you the difference between short-run and long-run aggregate supply. So basically there are two factors, right? So there are two factors that cause a shift in short-run aggregate supply. Now, if you remember, there's also a difference in the shape, but that's not our interest in this question. Our interest is only the factors that cause a shift in short-run aggregate supply, but not in the long run, right? Now, there are two factors that cause a shift in short-run aggregate supply. One was the quantity and quality of resources, right? Quantity, what is wrong with the writing pad today? Quantity and quality of resources, right? Just give me a second. So quantity and quality of resources, right? This factor also affects the long run aggregate supply, quantity and quality of resources. This not only affects the short run, this also affects the long run, quantity and quality of resources, right? Just a second. Quality of resources. And another factor that affects short run aggregate supply is cost of production, right? So these are the two factors that affect short run aggregate supply. As far as the long run aggregate supply is concerned, it's only the first factor. It's only the first factor that affect long run aggregate supply, not the second factor, not the second one, not the cost of production, right? Okay. Now this being said, we were supposed to, right, we were supposed to tell which is the cost. We were supposed to identify which of these is the cost of production, right? Now, if there is advancement in technology means that you are becoming more productive, you have better technology, so you can produce more. So that relates to quality of resources. Yes or no, Elsa? So that deals with quality of resources. So that will definitely affect both, right? Now, immigration of people of working age. So when immigration, I said immigration with an E means that people are going out of the country. So when more people go out of the country, don't you think that the quantity of resources in your country will deplete? The quantity of resources in your country will deplete. Now there's less of human resource to produce. And gross investment exceeding depreciation. Gross investment exceeding depreciation, again, when there's more, what it basically means, simply speaking, depreciation is the wear and tear of assets. Investment is basically how much more money you're investing, expanding your business, right? So when there's more money invested, then overall, then what would that do? Your overall investment will increase and there will be more output. But a change in money wage rate, right? Now, this is something that is cost, because this is money wage rate, as I just told you, that how much wages you're paying. So it is the wages that you pay to your worker, right? It's the wages that you pay to your worker. So money wage rate increase, it's change in the cost of production that will only affect the short run and not the long run. Got it? Right? Very good. Okay. What's the next question? Okay, perfect. Perfect. So if you're getting 4 incorrect, then you should be, you should be good. Okay. So Abdul Rahim has shared some questions. So we will do those. Let me quickly send you the new link, because this link is about to expire. I'm just sending you the new link right away.